introduce our three speakers today. So this is fantastic. We've got some great cross-border engagement today. So one of the purposes of this Salish Sea Roundtable is working with Canada and the US. So, areas of interest with both of us overlapping. We've had all sorts of interesting talks, and today happens to be about invasive species. So our first speaker will be Dr. Thomas Therriault. He's a senior research scientist at DFO. He's actually in my group. He specializes in aquatic invasive species. He's played a key role in coordinating international efforts to manage the spread of European green crab in the Salish Sea, and is one of the co-authors of the Salish Sea Transboundary Action Plan for invasive European green crab. He's contributed to the development of strategies aimed at mitigating the ecological and economic impacts of this invasive species. Our next presenter after that will be Dr. Lily Engel, so an early career postdoc that works at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. So she's going to be speaking specifically about the larval development and dispersion. So welcome, Dr. Engel. And finally, our third presenter will be Dr. Sean McDonald. He's an associate teaching professor in the program of the environment and a research scientist in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington. Several decades of experience studying the European green crab. His research focuses on species ecology, distribution, and impacts on native ecosystems. He recently led the Washington Sea Grant Crab Team, which is a citizen science initiative that monitors green crab populations in the Pacific Northwest. And he's done lots of work recently on eDNA for early detection. So quite a list of accolades for our three speakers today. So you want to hear less from me and more from them. So I'm going to pass it over to Great. And I welcome you guys to do your First Nations acknowledgement. So I am currently based in West Vancouver, which is the traditional territory for the Coast Salish people, Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. So with that, I'll pass it over to Tom and welcome everybody.
Okay, well, thank you for having us. When we were putting this together, Sean and I were discussing the 50 plus years that we have working together on invasive species issues. So I feel a little bit old. But yeah, it's great to have this opportunity to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing on aquatic invasive species and European green crab in the Salish Sea specifically. So as you heard in the introductions, it's myself and Lily and Sean that will each deal with different parts of this presentation. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of why we care about aquatic invasive species. They're typically not native to the ecosystem in which they're found. They can be introduced either intentionally, say through stocking or aquaculture activities, or more often unintentionally as hitchhikers, associated with a number of human-mediated activities, especially in our high-use coastal zone. There's a large number of ways that species can be introduced to an area, and unfortunately, only a few of these are regulated. So thinking of, international ballast water, for example. Why we're concerned is because they're a significant threat to biodiversity and ecosystem structure and function. And I'll go into some of these details for green crab in a few minutes. The other factor that we need to think about is that climate change is altering our marine ecosystems in major ways. And in a lot of cases, invaders are benefiting from these changes while native species continue to be impacted. Unfortunately, invasions continue at an alarming rate, not only here in Canada, but throughout the world. And, the more attention that we put into the research focus is that the social and economic impacts can be really significant, especially for coastal communities that rely on these marine ecosystems for sustenance. And a recent report from the UN pegged these damages on the tune of 423 billion annually. Thanks, Sean. So let's look at the species that we're talking about. I want to make sure that we're all thinking about the same invader when we're talking about the European green crab. So this is a shore crab. It's found usually up in the intertidal zone. It's got 5 spines on either side of the carapace that are quite distinct. It can get up to about 10 centimeters across, although most are sort of 6 to 8 centimeters. If you look at that last leg, it's flattened, which helps in swimming. And unlike the name suggests, they're not always green. They come in a wide variety of colors. So this is the organism that we're going to be talking about. Why are we talking about it? Well, we're talking about it in part because it's on the IUCN list of 100 worst invaders, one of the few marine species that's on this list. This species arrived in California, San Francisco Bay in the late 1980s with shipping material, bait worms or seafood, and like other species with a long-lasting larval stage, which we'll hear a little bit more detail in a few minutes. It allowed it to spread northwards at a fairly rapid rate, and so we've seen detections all the way up to Haida Gwaii, Southeast Alaska, and Prince Rupert over the last 2 or 3 years. And then our focus today is to think a little bit more with respect to the introduction into the Salish Sea. Now, why are we really concerned about green crab specifically? It's because it has three main impacts. We know that it can outcompete native species, including our native crab species. We know that it's a heavy consumer, so it can decimate shellfish beds. And maybe one of the more important factors that's less studied is that it can destroy critical habitats like eelgrass that support our salmon and Dungeness crabs and other things. And really, this is a good candidate for transboundary collaboration. What we do on our side of the border is going to be ineffective if Washington or Alaska are doing other things. So it does bring us together. So with respect to why green crab are found in so many areas, it really has to do with their broad tolerances. And so here's an example comparing European green crab with Gracilis, one of our native crabs. And what you see from the graph on the left is that this species, the green crab, is really occupying that high intertidal zone where it's avoiding competition with our native crabs. The other thing to look at is its salinity tolerance. So European green crab has a huge salinity tolerance, ranging from almost freshwater to fully marine, whereas our native crab is restricted to those high salinity waters. And so again, when we think about it from an invasion perspective, they're getting into areas that we don't have a lot of competition for from native species, and so they can establish themselves and then spread from there. They're also great generalists. So here we see in the chart that they can consume a wide variety of invertebrates. Here's a study that we did with respect to some different bivalves. And you can see that the consumption rate is extremely high, especially for the smaller year classes. But as I said, these green crab can compete and displace native crabs, and we're going to show you some data on that, as well as some of the work that we've done on habitat destruction through damage to eelgrass. So one of the things that we think about for an invader, especially an omnivore like European green crab, is what is it eating? What is it eating? And what we see from this graphic is, well, pretty much everything. They're not overly specific, either in their native range in Europe or other invaded locations around the globe. But I want to draw your attention to the arrows that are focusing on bivalves, mollusks, because we think that these could be good indicators of when green crab impacts are becoming problematic. So we dove into this in a little bit more detail with respect to some trials on different clam species, both through lab trials, which were more single species focused, and some mesocosms to try to extrapolate our understanding from the lab into the field. So I'll talk about the lab first. So here's just a simple multi-choice prey experiment where, green crab were given a choice between two common species in our southern waters. One is the Japanese littleneck or manila clam. The other is the very common varnish clam. And as you can see, green crab hit both of these species and in fairly equal rates. So both of these could conceivably be used as an ecosystem indicator for invasive species management. We then focused specifically on the manila clam, and we took it out and did a per capita consumption mesocosm experiment down in Souk in cooperation with Souk First Nation. And what you see from the graph here is that the per capita consumption, if you squint a little bit, looks like there's a density effect between about 3 and 5 crabs per square meter. And so again, this is a place where management could think about where that threshold is to get green crab density down to limit the impacts on our native ecosystems. We also know that green crabs can heavily hit our native shore crab, our native Hemigrapsis species. They're widely distributed through BC and Puget Sound and along the West Coast in general. So what we see here is a graph from California, from Ted Groschholz's work, where following the introduction event, Hemigrapsis and a native bivalve declined drastically in response to the incursion of European green crab. And so we wanted to build on this past study to really dive deeper into the impact of green crab on our native Hemigrapsis species. So again, we took this into the lab. We ran a multi-factor experiment where we had different levels of habitat complexity, different density of the prey species. We ran this for both purple and hairy shore crab multiple times for trials that were lasted about 6 hours at 16 degrees Celsius. And what do we see? We see that the hairy shore crab, Oregonensis, on the left of the upper chart was hit extremely hard, almost 90% mortality in the trials with this little shore crab. But the purple shore crab didn't escape damage. It actually was hit relatively hard too. So we know that both of these shore crabs are heavily affected by green crab invasion. And when we look across the density treatments and the habitat complexity treatments, really Oregonensis was impacted in all of these. And so this may be one of the species that disappears early when green crab density reaches problematic levels. And in fact, we've witnessed this in Barkley Sound, where we're hard pressed to find Hemigrapsis in areas where green crab have been for 20 plus years. We also know that our colleagues to the south have been doing work on the effect on Hemigrapsis and other things as well. So here we see work from Ben Rubinoff using crab team data. So the sites are shown for the most recent year of trapping, which was 2023. Highly variable abundance between the sites, but if we look across the multiple years of crab team data, so 2020 to 2023, using a multivariate analysis approach, many GLM, we're able to look at the both the univariate and the more complex relationships. And so we have community metrics that we can look at, and then we can dive deeper into some of the pairwise comparisons among species. And one of the things that we see here is that there's a strong negative correlation between the total CPUE and the green crab CPUE. So this is certainly not good news for our native species. We can look at what's driving this, and what we see is that the community responses are largely through hairy shore crab, staghorn sculpins, eastern mud snail. And then when we analyze this data, or when Ben analyzed this data at the trap level, it was really the hairy shore crab, staghorn sculpin, stickleback, and sand shrimp that were really driving the community response. We can also look at some work that Ben did using tethering experiments, tying a little tether to Hemigrapsis and then sticking them out and letting green crab eat them. And what we see, the takeaway from this is the two sites, the ones in the north there, Nakata and Stackpole, these were the sites that had higher green crab density. And what you see is most of the hairy shore crab were consumed at these sites. And so again, it speaks to the fact that we know that European green crab is really hitting these Hemigraptis species hard, because we see the highest mortality at sites with the highest green crab density. So again, if we're thinking about how we might mitigate this, we need to get those green crab numbers down so that the native species can benefit. Finally, we can look at some additional data from Mary Fisher's work on eDNA. And again, what we see through her eDNA diet analysis work is that the hairy shore crab was by far the most consumed species across sites, and this reinforces the ideas that were identified in the tethering experiment, as well as some of the work that was done here in British Columbia. It's also important to note that it's not just the hairy shore crab that's affected. You know, the sand shrimp and the staghorn sculpin were also common items in the green crab diet, speaking to the earlier idea that these things are, you know, eating a wide variety of things when they invade your ecosystem. We can also look at damage to eelgrass. This is a study that we had done a few years ago. Again, another type of mesocosm where we have different densities of European green crab in these intertidal mesocosms. And what we see is in treatments with the high density, the blue line, we see the eelgrass is significantly affected, much more so than the low density or the two controls in this experiment. So again, this is something where we can think about, you know, the thresholds that may be required. So if you're at 2 green crab per square meter, the effect isn't really that noticeable. But when you're over 5, the effect is quite noticeable. Now, of course, for an invader like European green crab, you know, the effects are only realized if the species can actually get to the sites that you're thinking about. So this is where we need to think about the connectivity aspect. And so Lily's going to talk a little bit more about work that she's done with respect to some particle tracking to figure out how connected green crab populations are on the coast.
Thanks, Tom, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Lily. I'm a postdoc at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and this has been my main project I'm working on with collaborators from the Salish Sea modeling team, Laki Pramathilake and Therriault Kangankar, and my postdoc advisor, Lizelle Garavelli, and it's funded by the US EPA. So as Tom kind of already hinted at, larval dispersal is key to the spread of the invasive European green crab. And this is primarily because each female can release potentially up to 185,000 larvae per spawning event. And then these larvae are carried in the oceanographic currents and can get brought all over. Whereas once they're adults, they have pretty low mobility and kind of stay put. And so we're hoping that our modeling can help fill the gaps between the data samples from all the effort that everybody's doing to manage the species. Next slide, thanks. So the way we're doing this is we have a biophysical larval dispersal model. So we used our hydrodynamic model from the Salish Sea Modeling Center. We use the Salish Sea model. And this is housed at University of Washington, Tacoma and Pacific Northwest National Lab. So our grid and our domain is shown at the bottom of the slide here. So you can see that our domain goes from the Oregon coast up to north of Vancouver Island and then including within the Salish Sea. So we take the velocities and temperature per location and time from our model outputs, and we put that into a larval dispersal model, which is a Lagrangian particle tracking model called ICHTHIOP, but it's made for larvae, so it has a lot of information about the behavior of the larvae and mortality and other transport. And from there, we get the larvae position at each time step.
Oops.
And so we have one paper so far, but this is an ongoing project. But for this talk, I wanted to highlight the larval connectivity, especially between the US and Canada, because while we may have borders, the European green crab does not respect those. And so this really is a transboundary issue for us to work together on. The figure on the left shows highly connected regions we found in our first study. So the colors correspond to highly connected areas. So you can see the Pacific coast of Washington and Oregon is highly connected. And then the red area shows that the coast of Vancouver Island and South Strait of Juan de Fuca and the San Juan Islands is also highly connected, again, highlighting the importance of us to work across our border. And so here is a link for our paper, but as I said, this work is ongoing. Oh, and it looks like Lizelle sent it in the chat. Thanks, Lizelle. So next slide. This is a 4-year project. We've only done 1 year. So we are planning to keep going, and we're going to be including behavior of the crab, whereas that first study was more passive particles. And we also kind of focused on Washington in the first study, but our next study, we're including all of within the Salish Sea in Canada. But we're definitely interested in using trapping data as well to validate with our predicted sediment locations. And we've been meeting with a lot of groups to collect and gather data from what everyone has been working on. But if someone in the audience hasn't heard about us or we haven't talked to you, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to work with you. And yeah, and then our last step will be to have different hydrodynamic scenarios for climate change and other future scenarios that we'll be comparing to for this future of the invasion. And so now I'll pass it on to Sean.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. I appreciate that. My name is Sean McDonald, and it's my privilege to talk a little bit about the management landscape, especially the transboundary management landscape. I am an ecologist by training, and so I'm much more comfortable with the ecology that Tom covered, but I'm going to do my best not to butcher the management piece at all. Please feel free to correct me if I get something wrong. I do want to recognize that I have been privileged to work with Washington Sea Grant's crab team for the last 10 plus years. Certainly don't lead that group. I'm privileged, though, to participate as a member of the team. I've been around since the beginning, so I guess that counts for something. The Washington Sea Grant's crab team has been involved in early detection and monitoring work for green crab in the inland waters of Washington State since 2014 and later on the coast as well. I, of course, have been working on green crab since nearly the beginning, about 25 years. Crab team does a couple of things. The primary activities of crab team is really just in monitoring, but also in advising management, building technical capacity, and also in applied research, some of the studies that Tom already talked about. Okay. So in thinking about management of green crab in the transboundary area, I'm going to lean heavily on a figure that my colleague Emily Grayson put together. So big shout out to her for putting this together. And I'm going to illustrate sort of the interconnectedness of different aspects of management. And so the idea here is that I'll be talking about sort of different pieces of the management puzzle and highlighting similarities and differences between Canada and the US. And so primarily I'm talking about decision-making, action, the research, and sort of the public interface side of things too. And so I just want to highlight that in Canada, DFO is the federal agency with authority for management in consultation with First Nations. And in the US, the state of Washington, through the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, has the authority on state lands, and tribes have authority over their sovereign tribal lands. These entities are primarily responsible for management planning and policy interface, as well as securing and distributing funding. In Washington, WDFW also convenes the Multi-Agency Coordination Group, or MAC group, where DFO actually is a participant. Now, there's a whole host of groups that take part in augmenting crab teams' early detection work and efforts, and participate also in control trapping and reducing the spread of green crab, which is incredibly important within the inland waters of the Salish Sea. Notice that there is actually a lot of overlap with the decision-making group between tribes, First Nations, as well as agencies. In Washington, I want to point out that the shellfish industry is much larger and more heavily invested in efforts to control green crab as well. Whereas in Canada, these efforts are augmented by a lot of environmental, non-governmental organizations that DFO works with. On both sides of the border, management is intended to be driven by emerging science. And as Tom and Lily have already pointed out and highlighted, there's some important science already going on. And that was just sort of a smattering of things. We have a lot more that we could, of course, talk about. And a critical part of our transboundary relationship is collaboration and sharing science. And this really helps to sort of maximizing our efficacy and our efficiency in the work that we are doing. So and the last piece of the puzzle that I'll point out is the role of the public. And that really cannot be overstated either. In both BC and in Washington, surveillance and monitoring are enhanced by a vigilant public. So there are extensive and ongoing efforts to increase visibility of this issue and to provide opportunities for groups and individuals to get involved. And I'll cover a little bit about that. I'm going to go into each one of these in just a little bit more detail. So I do want to highlight the role that the emergency and disaster declarations have played in the management of green crab, particularly in Washington state. The Lummi Nation declared an emergency in November of 2021, the Shoalwater Bay Tribe in January of 2022, Washington state through Governor Inslee's emergency order declared in 2022 in January. And then the Quinault Indian Nation declared an emergency in April of 2024. And these are probably the most visible outputs of sort of the management, and that sort of catalyzed a lot of additional action and movement, particularly on the Washington side of the border. So in particular, I want to highlight the development of the incident command system. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it because it's very detailed and there's a lot going on there, but I will say it's extensive in that it one of the really important parts is the formation of the multi-agency coordination group, which includes Department of Fisheries and Oceans representation. So Canada has a seat at the table too. And a more recent product of this work, which was the development of the European Green Crab Management Plan for Washington state. And so I do want to highlight that the only real viable option we have for removing green crab from our shared waters is trapping, or in some places, capturing crabs by hand. And of course, that is incredibly laborious work, and it would not be possible without a tremendous amount of effort across the shorelines of Washington and British Columbia by a large and committed group of amazing professionals. Some of whom are shown in this image, and there really are too numerous to mention, and so I apologize if I don't call you out, but really, honestly, I am thankful every day for an opportunity to work with all of these great folks who are doing incredibly difficult work under sometimes less than ideal conditions, trying to remove as many green crab as possible. As I mentioned, in both BC and Washington, surveillance and monitoring are really enhanced by a vigilant public. And so Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Washington Sea Grant, and DFO work extensively to educate the public about the threat of green crab and to provide resources and opportunities for action as well. And just a couple of pictures highlighting some of that work in progress. I also want to specifically call out some of the work that Crab Team has been doing. As I mentioned, Washington Sea Grant, along with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and some other partners, teamed up to sort of lead this volunteer-based early detection and monitoring program to help improve our understanding, not only of the spread of green crab, but also our understanding of native salt marshes and pocket estuaries that can be affected by green crab. And so currently there are over 300 active volunteers in this program monitoring 68 sites across Washington waters. More recently, Washington Sea Grant started along with Washington State University. So it's a UW-Wazoo collaboration. Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. It's a volunteer-based early detection program that's focused on inland shorelines of Washington State. And this is actually an app-based program that allows volunteers to do timed molt hunts to search for evidence of green crabs in the form of molted shells. So it's a little bit like an Easter egg hunt. And If you're not familiar with the program, I would encourage you to get involved because it's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to help contribute to surveillance efforts. So in addition to sort of that just brief overview of the management landscape, I want to give you a little bit of a timeline. So I hope you will indulge me because it took me a long time to put this together. So first things first, I do want to just give you an overview. And the first thing that I will start with is the arrival of green crab in our neck of the woods. So green crab first arrived in San Francisco Bay, probably back in the late 80s, but they ended up in the waters of Washington State and British Columbia around 1998. And for about, well, roughly 2 decades, well, a little over a decade, sorry, a little over a decade, most of the talk or transboundary conversation around green crab was among scientists who were interested in monitoring their spread and also potential impacts. And it wasn't really until the discovery of a large, well-developed population in Souk Basin, British Columbia in 2012 that we started to think about a more specific management focus for the inland waters. So this is back in 2012. By 2012, the population at Souk Basin was already very well established. This got us all to thinking about what we could do to monitor the spread of green crab within inland waters. More specifically, DFO was already doing some things on their side of the border, but we wanted to engage volunteers on our side, on the Washington side, and so Crab Team was launched in 2015. And by 2016, we had already made our first capture. The first green crab caught in the inland waters of Washington State was on San Juan Island in 2016 by Crab Team volunteers. So this precipitated greater interest in management and management discussions across our shared border. As Lily said, green crab know no boundaries. And so we had our first transboundary meeting in 2017. Fish and Wildlife was there from Washington, as well as DFO, Washington Sea Grant, as well as Puget Sound Partnership contributed to that meeting. And of course, green crab continued to spread because of favorable ocean conditions. And we saw a major population increase on the coast, on the outer coast of Washington and likely British Columbia in 2017. This precipitated, well, I should say, there was a large population growth on the coast, and we also saw that in inland waters. And in particular, there was a discovery of green crab at Dungeness Spit, where green crab were found in a Crab Team monitoring site there. And this finding led to enhanced transboundary discussions, in part because of the close proximity of Dungeness Spit to that large established population in Souk Basin. As a result, DFO, Crab Team, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife increased site visits and data exchange and sample sharing. This photo was taken during one of those trips to Souk Basin, where we participated in a joint effort to collect genetic samples for evaluation. In 2017, DFO created aquatic invasive species manager positions to address green crab in British Columbia, and these managers were charged with developing monitoring and control efforts and increasing outreach there. As in sort of follow-up to that increased capacity on the British Columbia side, we did a lot more in terms of technical expertise exchange. In fact, we had several events where representatives of Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington, DFO in Canada, and Washington Sea Grant participated in some methods exchange and shared learning. And then in 2018, representatives of Washington, DFO, Washington Sea Grant, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, DFO, Washington Sea Grant, and PSP developed the Transboundary Action Plan that articulated our shared understanding of green crab threats, and it also detailed our shared goals for management, particularly in reducing spread throughout the Salish Sea. But of course, green crab continued to spread as they experienced favorable ocean conditions. And in 2019, they became established in the artificial pond on the Lummi Nation Reservation. This was particularly concerning because of the concern among scientists and managers that the pond could actually act as an incubator and grow a very large population quickly, which in fact it did. Fortunately, the Lummi Nation undertook some very extensive and rigorous removal trapping there over multiple years to reduce the population within the sea pond. And that went on through COVID in 2020 and 2021. This did impact transboundary cooperation somewhat because of restrictions, but work went on both sides of the border using our COVID protocols. And then I did want to point out that in 2022, green crab were captured at Annette Island in Alaska. So now we have not only a transboundary between Washington and BC, but also between BC and Alaska that we have to consider. In 2021 and 2022, that's when the emergency declarations took place. This was the Lummi Nation, the Shoalwater Bay Tribe, as well as the Washington Governor's Office. And because of that increased emergency effort, that's when we had the formation of the Multi-Agency Coordination Group, which, as I mentioned, DFO participates in. And then in 2023, Washington Sea Grant Crab Team developed and launched the MOLT search program with Washington State University. And that leads us to 2024, where we had a mild El Nino. El Ninos tend to favor green crab population increase and spread, which we have seen. And in 2024, we also saw the Quinault tribe declare an emergency there as well. And so this work is ongoing. I just want to just oh so briefly highlight one of the transboundary initiatives that we participated in recent years. This is something we did back in 2022 with DFO, where we participated in a working group to help identify monitoring sites in British Columbia. DFO was using 3 different models, that MaxInt, the CPUE and PA, and the RSS models. And we wanted to also compare the Washington Sea Grant model that we were using to identify our monitoring sites in Washington State and on the in both inland and on the coast. And so through that shared effort and exchange, we were able to develop a set of priority sites. In this case, this is a multi-model approach. So we identified these early detection sites, and we were able to rank those. What you're looking at here in red, those 5, or what's labeled as 5, those are the high priority sites that could be used for monitoring work within the BC waters of the Salish Sea. So I do just want to close by saying, just giving you some general takeaways that Tom and Lily and I discussed, and that is that really that there is no quick fix to the green crab crisis. Management will require a continued effort to reduce spread and impact. And through continued effort, we might be able to prevent substantial impacts like those that Tom has already started talking about. We could at least reduce those impacts in some places. Management definitely requires transboundary cooperation. Tom said something very zen earlier, that we need to look outward, not inward. I really appreciated that, but we really do need to recognize that green crab do not recognize our geopolitical boundaries. So transboundary cooperation is critical. And then finally, the efficacy and efficiency of our efforts is really enhanced by working together and learning from each other. And that's why I think it's so vital that we continue these conversations. With that, we have lots of people to thank, and I won't go into naming them all, but our contact information is here as well if you'd like to reach out to any of us about what we discussed.
Thank you, Sean, Lily, and Tom. Excellent presentation. And I'll give you full points for ending 2 minutes early, which is, I don't think I've moderated a conference topic presentation before where there was, where I'm usually not going, okay, I'm tapping you out. You're over, you're 5 minutes over. So thank you for that. A great mix of presentation material from, like you sort of said, Sean, the ecosystem dynamic side of it, and then getting into that management piece, which often this group tends to be more focused on the ecosystem side of it, but for issues such as this, we cannot ignore the management side of it, or else we're just watching the car wreck again and again. So yeah, thanks very much. So we'll move into our Q&A discussion. And so preferably if people can raise their hands. There's a lot of stuff that shows up in the chat, so people can raise their hand up. We'd love to hear your question and see your smiling face. And if not, we'll try and moderate some of the questions in the chat if people don't have that ability. I think you can just raise your hand. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sandra. All right, I've got Anne's hand. Oh, look, hands are coming up. Perfect. Anne, I'll hand it over to you first, and you're welcome to turn your camera on too.
Thank you. As one of the first people to hustle to volunteer for crab team in Kitsap County, already then we knew that the European green crab had been a real scourge on the Atlantic coast and elsewhere in the world. And it's not that I'm feeling bitter or anything. I'm just wondering how come we didn't think about this decades sooner.
That's a great question, Anne. I'll maybe pass this one over to Sean, since he was more talking about the management side of it. Sean, you feel okay with the hot seat there?
Sure, I'll try not to step in it too much or aggravate anyone. I mean, I think it's a good question, and I think this speaks to invasive species issues in general, and part of that is that a lot of non-native species that spread around the world, we don't actually hear about, in part because many of them sort of fizzle out. They're spread around. Populations might persist for a little while, and then they die out. Or it takes an extremely long time for those populations to grow. And because they're existing at very, very low levels, they just tend not to be a priority when there's so many other things that occupy everyone's attention. In the case of green crab, they've been on the U.S. West Coast since the late 80s when they were established in San Francisco Bay. No one really paid too much attention to them until their populations exploded. And even in Washington State, there was an early effort to monitor and control green crab in Willapa Bay back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But as their population just sort of fizzled for several years, resources were diverted. And part of that has to do, if you want a little economic history lesson, part of it was because of the dot-com bubble bursting, if you remember that, back in the dot-com days, and the recession in Washington State that led to sort of a retraction of the economy here. So anyway, it's an interesting phenomenon, and hindsight's always 20/20.
Thanks, Sean. Hopefully that addressed your question, Anne. But yeah, aquatic invasive species are definitely more challenging than terrestrial as well. So that's another issue to deal with. Kim, I've got you next up. Go ahead.
Hi there. I'm on a tiny phone. We'll see what that means.
That's okay. You don't have, I'm not forcing people. We're just trying to, it's nice to see faces and connect. So go ahead, Kim.
So tuning in from Cowichan Valley here in BC, and part of Cowichan Tribes where we are monitoring, doing trapping for monitoring. And we were really interested in the molt surveys and been trying that out. It's not really done much here in BC as I understand it, but I'm curious if anyone can comment on how that's working in the States so far with have you had a lot of uptake from like citizen science, etc.?
Yeah, so Sean, I think this one's over to you as well, or
Sure.
Lily, maybe if she can contribute, because I know they're doing more the larval dispersion, but I'll park it with you, Sean, and jump in if you want, Lily.
Sure. I will just say very, very quickly that we are hitting a milestone right now with our molt search program. I think that Lisa Watkins, who helps manage that program, does a fantastic job. Just told us earlier this week that we hit 1,000 reports in our very young program. So that's a step in the right direction. And we're getting a lot of folks engaged and involved. In fact, Lisa and her counterparts at Washington State University just put in a lot of effort on trainings over the last month to get people geared up to do that molt search protocol this season. So we're expecting a very large increase in reports. And I would love to find a way to spread that up into BC. There are some technical challenges with our reporting system, but I think Lisa is already sort of talking with folks about that as well.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for your question, Kim. We'll switch over to we're still on this side of the border. Aaron from ECCC, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Good to see you. Thanks, everyone, for the excellent information. I had a question on the modeling work that's been done for the larvae. I've looked at the paper and what's been published online, but is it possible to, in a way, kind of zoom in on different areas and sort of see in higher level of detail sort of how the larvae are anticipated to move in specific areas?
Yes, that is definitely possible. We have a task specifically for dynamics within the Lummi Sea Pond that we are working on. So one of my teammates refined the grid specifically in the Lummi area, and we also have a higher resolution model we can use as well, but it's very computationally expensive. So it's good to prioritize using that model for very specific zoomed in studies. But we are definitely open to collaboration or future requests. So if you have a specific area you're interested in, potentially we could work together.
Thanks, Lily. That's great.
I
think
that would be
Aaron,
great.
when
Thank
we
you.
look to the management, when we look to the management side, it's always a little bit more oceanographic models. Their spatial scales tend to be quite large. So trying to focus in on areas is important. So I don't see any other hands up. I'm going to ask a question. Tom, you were talking about salinity tolerance differences between our native species and introduced species. What about temperature tolerance, as we're talking about climate change and how that's a shifting benchmark for us? Can you give us a little detail?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, we have looked into this. We've done some habitat mapping, as you know as well. The temperature is not limiting on the Pacific coast. You can go pretty much from northern Mexico well into the Gulf of Alaska and have suitable temperature conditions for European green crab. And of course, climate change is only going to expand that range further north. And some of our projections to 2075 see propagules surviving, almost to the Aleutians and beyond. So this is not a problem that climate change is going to fix for us. It's actually going to make it worse. And maybe the centroid will shift a few degrees north, but it's not like it's going to retreat a lot to the south.
I sort of knew that was the answer, but an unfortunate answer. But Elise, I see. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Elise or Elsie? Did I get that wrong?
Yeah, it's Elise.
Okay, good. Starting with that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Alrighty. So far, it sounds like the transboundary collaboration has been largely opportunistic, and there hasn't been a formal bilateral body with governmental support that supports the coordination on this issue. My question is, notwithstanding the current global affairs, would there be any benefit to having a more formalized body to help coordinate the sharing of information and also planning? And if so, what structures might be used to accomplish that?
Yeah, I'll leave that to any of the authors to respond to that might have a suggestion on that.
I think Sean was itching. I just see him. So
there you go.
ahead,
Sean, your turn.
I like that, Tom. You unmute yourself just long enough to throw it to me. Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point, Elise. I do think that there are some structures in place already, and there's a lot of opportunistic work. DFO and Washington Sea Grant, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife have been working together for a very long time, and of course there's the multi-agency coordination group. There's also a green crab West Coast working group, which is maybe not necessarily a governmental body, but it's a body of scientists that come together to share information and share the science. But I do, I am a big fan of a more formalized group for sharing information across the border in very structured ways. And I think that there are models that we could probably learn from in other contexts, like in fisheries management and elsewhere, that would allow us to kind of formalize those relationships and formalize the transboundary management and data sharing as well. And Tom, I would love to hear your take on this as a DFO employee.
Well, thanks, Sean. I think the real issue is it needs to be fit for purpose. And so I guess, as Sean mentioned in his timeline, when critical problems came up, we freely reached across the border on the science front to, make sure that our limited resources weren't being, redundant or not wisely used. And I think when we scale up from that and start to bring in other elements, policy, management, etc., there's so many silos, and we keep saying, I don't know how many DFO talks I've been in, we're breaking down the silos, and it's like, we're not breaking down the silos, they're still there. And so I would say, if there was a way to focus on the objectives and then identify how you go about reshaping the structure, the sharing, so that's open and transparent and productive. Again, I think what I've heard up and down the coast is this is an invader that people don't want. And so how can we work together to get rid of it? How can we learn from each other so we are as effective and efficient as possible? And I think that it's not necessarily a single unit that's going to sort of be the nexus to bring that together. I think it's multiple groups and agencies that really we need the network of the networks to sort of do the problem solving on this one. It's just too diverse and too fragmented if we try to put everything into one lens. I think it's going to break. That's just my thoughts on that. That's not official government of Canada speak.
I won't correct you, Tom. That's fine. And I think I'll just add to that is you look at the number of groups and volunteers that are associated with these projects as well. Like this is, community science in action. You look at how many different bays, estuaries, like up and down the coast, like they're talking about from, San Francisco to Alaska. This cannot be done by one coordinating body. We need to mobilize, the public, communities. These are their beaches. This is their ecosystem that they want to protect. So how can we train them, give them resources to help them help us, I guess would be how I'd wrap that up. So there's a couple other questions in the chat that seem to have answered themselves. So local predators that develop a taste for green crab, answered by someone working on their master's in University of Alberta, looking at sea otters, mink, and river otters for consumption. I think Tom's regularly asked about how do they taste, because people are amazing predators. As soon as we like something, we have a pretty good impact on the ecosystem. That's not official government speak either, but
no, but share with enough garlic butter, they do taste okay.
Yeah.
When you steam them, they turn a bright red color, which is quite beautiful. But I do want to highlight one question I saw in the chat that I thought was interesting. And it was Naomi Hemley mentioned that mentions I've run into problems with the public image about trapping when people realize we are not likely to fully eradicate European green crab. So the science behind why it's important and worthwhile to do trapping efforts to lower density of green crab. I think this sort of speaks to this, commonly, I think it does sometimes deflate people when we tell them that this is an ongoing issue, that it's not something that we're likely to be able to just end promptly. We're going to have to continue management efforts into the future. But Tom, through his impacts work, was hinting at a really important point, which is that we can knock back abundance in places to below certain thresholds. Tom, you want to speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so I think, I think the original goal with any invader is if you catch them early when populations are small and contained, you can eradicate them. And then the problem essentially disappears forever. Clearly for green crab, we're past that point. We're not ever going to eradicate green crab on the Pacific coast. They're just too widespread already. But what we can do is reduce the density of green crab, especially around important areas, shellfish harvest sites, eelgrass habitats, to a level where we know that the impact of green crab is largely mitigated at low density. And so that's what I was speaking to with respect to the per capita and the threshold work that we're trying to do to inform decision making. And so instead of saying we need to go and kill every green crab on a beach, we can go out and with scientific information say we need to get to say 2 or 3 green crab per square meter. And so if we know that we can trap down to a certain level, it gives trappers a target. So it's not just an open-ended goal. And we have evidence that if you get the populations low enough, then the impacts that we're most concerned about largely blend in with the background environmental variability that we see on beaches from year to year. And in which case, most communities would see that as an acceptable level of consequence. And so what we're really talking about is mitigating those unacceptable levels where we know we see the impacts manifested at high densities. And we've got sites in BC well above 8, 9, 10 crabs per square meter. Lummi Sea Pond was certainly above that range as well. And there we see these long persistent impacts that everybody wants to avoid, but it's not, if we can't get rid of it, game over. No, we can actually be effective with targeted removals. And it means that there will be trade-offs like other decisions. And that's the hard part that we have to come to grips with, is that we can't protect everything everywhere. We just don't have the resources to do it. And it's hard to draw those lines on maps and indicate that certain things essentially are not going to be protected or not fully protected.
Thanks, Tom. So with that, we'll close it out. Thank you to our 3 authors today. Their contact information is on the slide here and would welcome further dialogue. Thanks to Sandra and the Puget Sound Institute for hosting and pulling this together.